bring in former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, and former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. Thank you so much both for joining us. General, let me start with you. These cluster bombs, Russia's control now of a Ukrainian nuclear power plant. Does this change the game?
Well, it certainly signals that they are dropping all restraint on the use of weapons to terrorize the civilian population, to destroy infrastructure. There's no restraint. So, I mean, that's what it's going to be like for the rest of the time until this is over. So we need to be prepared for that.
And so, Mr. Secretary, Russia potentially is committing war crimes out in the open now. What's your take? What does that tell you about where this is headed?
Well, I think it's not potentially committing war crimes. They are committing war crimes. And I'm afraid to say, I think this will continue, particularly as Putin is disappointed in the ability of his actual troops to get control over Kyiv and Kharkiv. And I think this means eventually there'll be perhaps an international law investigation. Whether that will amount to anything in terms of the ability to actually bring Putin into some kind of court is very doubtful. But some of the people who are aiding and abetting him may ultimately face some kind of a legal reckoning.
So is that what would have to happen? Putin would have to turn himself in if he were to be prosecuted for war crimes?
Either someone would have to perhaps depose him and then turn him over. More likely what you would see is some of the people who are enabling this might go to try to travel at some point and then might be arrested. We saw that, for example, with war crimes that were committed in the Balkans some years back. But, you know, to be candid, I wouldn't hold my breath that Putin is ever going to face legal accountability. I think the bigger issue for him is whether the Russian public at some point holds him accountable.
And I guess more immediately, how does this war stop? Zelensky has suggested that he and Putin should have direct talk, saying there is no other way to stop this war. General, what do you think about that?
Well, as long as we understand who we're talking to, President Putin obviously is not somebody that can be reasoned with. And so I think this, in order for us to have some sort of successful negotiation, which will be how this ends, we're going to have to recognize that they're always seeking a position of advantage. And now, if I may, you know, this nuclear power plant that they have fired at and captured reminds me that in Lithuania, there's another nuclear plant called Ostrovets nuclear power plant. Our Lithuanian allies are terrified of this thing because it's built by the same people that brought you Chernobyl. It's very, very close to the city of Vilnius. And now that Belarus has said that they no longer are neutral, President Lukashenko has lifetime immunity, and they welcome Russian nuclear weapons into Belarus, I see that this is another potentially very dangerous situation that could be used by the Kremlin.
Zelensky has been urging NATO and the U.S. to establish a no-fly zone, and NATO is saying, no, we aren't going to do that. The U.S. says absolutely not, because that could create a direct conflict between the U.S. or NATO troops and Russia, and then we have a world war. And we know, Secretary Chertoff, there is no appetite in America to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. I wonder, how much does what's happening over there impact U.S. national security right now? Is the home front more or less vulnerable while Russia's waging this war in Ukraine?
Well, we clearly have to be concerned about particularly a cyber attack. As we increase sanctions on the financial sector, and as there's an impact on the energy exports that the Russians use to basically fund themselves, there is an increased risk that there'll be some kind of cyber attack on critical infrastructure. Now, the U.S. has warned Russia, if you do that, we will respond in kind. And so, therefore, there should be some deterrent effect. But it's a little hard to calibrate with Putin exactly how seriously he takes deterrence and to what extent he's going to feel impelled to try to visit some kind of cyber consequence on the United States. For that reason, DHS and other U.S. government agencies have been warning the private sector and working particularly with the financial community and the energy sector to make sure that they are tuning up their defenses and are prepared to meet a potential ransomware attack or other cyber attack.
Mr. Secretary, are you surprised we haven't seen that kind of retaliatory attack at this point?
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm surprised. I would not have been surprised if we had seen something already, but it's only been a few days since the sanctions have been in effect. And I don't know whether Putin is planning at some point in the near future to do something, or whether at this point he's so focused on trying to get boots on the ground throughout Ukraine that is really preoccupying him. I also don't know to what extent the people around him who are responsible for dealing with cyber attacks may be a little reluctant, because they may be doubting whether this is a wise thing on which to double down.
General, we know the U.S. is sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians at a, quote, frenetic pace, but officials tell us real-time U.S. intel gathering is limited right now, right? We don't have anybody on the ground, and there's an apparent lack of military drones flying overhead. So without being there, how helpful is that information?
Well, I think that the considerable intelligence capabilities of the United States and of the UK are probably significant. We're sharing intelligence in a way that I've never seen before. I mean, so much. Of course, it would be better if we had actual troops that were there to talk what we call human intelligence. That would be very helpful. But within the parameters we have, I suspect we're doing a very good job of providing things from imagery and signals intelligence, things that we are intercepting.
General Ben Hodges and former DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff, thank you both so much for taking time to share your expertise and insights.